Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. I really hope that you like the summit and you're enjoying all the different sessions and the insights that the speakers are providing. We have a very interesting panel discussion today. The topic is on the role of GRC during and post-COVID business environment. We have two esteemed panelists, and they are analysts in this space, and who have been covering the governance, risk, and compliance for more than 25 years. Introducing you to Michael Rasmussen. Michael is the head analyst in the GRC 2020, and he has been covering the GRC space for more than 25 years. I would request Michael to introduce himself.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to interacting on the panel. I'm Michael Rasmussen of GRC 2020 Research, and my job is to understand and research what keeps organizations up at night in the context of governance, risk, and compliance, and how they go about solving that with strategy, process, and technology.
Thank you so much, Michael. And our second esteemed panelist is Sid Dash. Sid is an analyst at the Chartis Research and have been covering governance, risk, and compliance for the last couple of years. Sid, if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. So my name is Sidhartha Dash, or Sid Dash for ease of pronunciation and simplicity. I've been in risk management and compliance for nearly 27 odd years in a variety of roles, starting with large banks and then through funds, and then as a technology consultant, and then with Chartis for the last nearly half a decade or more. So at Chartis, we are a risk and analytics focused analyst firm, risk analytics and compliance. And then my role is essentially to look at the quantitative aspects, the underlying technology, the underlying data elements, and we look at the entire sort of risk and compliance landscape, looking at specifically the many of the technology and data aspects, technology, data, and analytics aspects of that process.
Thank you, Sid. And just to start off the session, between both of you, both of the analysts, I just realized that we have more than 50 years of experience on this panel alone, right? And I think it's one of the most interesting times. I know it's tough as well, but if you look at the current business environment, like any of the other functions, the governance, risk, and compliance are also heavily impacted due to the changing business dynamics and the economic environment today. Overnight, risk, compliance, and audit functions had to change their way of working, and COVID has accelerated the digital transformation journey across all industries and departments. And this has impacted the GRC functions as well. So I would like to spend a little bit of time to understand how the GRC functions are coping with this particular challenge and how are they enabling the business in this particular critical environment. So, just to start with you, Michael, in fact, Michael and Sid was there on the last GRC summit on a panel discussion as well. And in the last summit, Michael spoke about how interconnected risks are impacting the organizations. I just want to get your view in terms of how do you see these organizations addressing this, after the 6 months, since we have spoken on the last summit.
Certainly. I've seen a lot of organizations rethink their enterprise and operational risk management strategies. Historically, if you looked at enterprise and operational risk management, a lot of organizations had it predominantly focused on IT security. Now, IT security is a significant risk. I started my career in IT security back in 1993, and I understand it. But some of the other risks that we're facing in the organization include environmental risks with climate change and health and safety risks like COVID-19. And so I'm starting to see, because of this pandemic, and I called this out back in last December in 2019, I wrote a blog called The Tale of Two Futures. Is our future a Blade Runner future or a Star Trek future? And basically stating that a lot of these enterprise and operational risk management programs are not balanced because they're not focused on some of the most significant risks organizations as well as the world are facing, and environmental risks and health and safety risks. Then along comes COVID-19 to prove my point. And I see over these last 6 months to even going back to a year, a lot of restructuring of enterprise and operational risk management programs for it to be more balanced in its coverage of the risks that can impact the organization. And part of that is to be able to see the interconnectedness of risk. A lot of organizations, see risk in these little silos and departments, and fail to connect risk as it intersects throughout the organization and its operations. You take something like COVID-19. It's a health and safety risk at its core, but it has downstream risk impacts of IT security risks, like from the work from home environment, increased risk of fraud because of the economic risk, operational resiliency and continuity risks, third party and supply chain risks, which also include bribery and corruption risks because supply chains are constrained and some employee might bribe a foreign government official to expedite goods through customs. We've even seen rise in harassment and discrimination risks. People are working from home, they're in all these Zoom meetings and other web conferencing type calls. And in that context, working from a home environment, they're a little more relaxed and they're saying things that wouldn't be acceptable in the corporate environment at times. And so we've even seen increased harassment and discrimination risks. And what has to happen is we have to be able to see this interconnectedness of risk and see the aggregate risk exposure on the organization and have a balanced view of risk. And I see a lot of organizations restructuring to address that. As well as restructuring to engage the front lines, the first line of the organization, from operational management down to the remote employee, and particularly from the work from home environment. But I think we'll get back into some of those things in some of the follow-up questions.
Thank you, Michael. It's a great insight on that. And Sid, if you could also give us your insights on this.
Well, from our perspective, the single biggest thing that we see is that institutions realize that in many ways, the interconnection between the organizations is manifested by the IT infrastructure. Yeah, and COVID-19 has made that dramatically clear. The backbone of every organization is its IT infrastructure. The organization is the IT infrastructure, if you will. So there's a much higher focus on the IT infrastructure than it was in the past. In many ways, there used to be a lot of the thinking around cyber risk and so on, but a lot of it was rather perfunctory. You needed to focus on cyber risk because people told you to, because there were big fines and there were big significant events that happened to your neighbor or something like that. But now people really realize that there are many dimensions of cyber risk. There are many dimensions with a more distributed workforce. I don't necessarily mean only working from home, because post-COVID, it may turn out that many institutions will never go back to the highly centralized infrastructure they had. They may have hundreds of offices or maybe have 50. It is clear that the architecture of firms will not remain exactly the same as it is. So IT and ops infrastructure, there's a lot more focus on it, analyzing it, thinking about it, deciding what your risk posture should be. I think there's a lot more of focus. In the initial part of the pandemic, a lot of the institutions, particularly financial institutions and energy firms, their focus was on just surviving the risk, surviving COVID-19, ensuring that everybody operationally had had infrastructure to communicate and work, ensuring that they could get regulatory reports back to their reporting organizations, to the regulators, and so on. But I think in the second half, there's been a lot more thinking on, okay, now what are the new risks that we are exposed to? How does our risk exposure change? Can we analyze this and quantify this in a more structured way than ever before? Linked to that, I think there has been a trend in the last 2-3 years to involve front office a lot more, to involve the P&L infrastructure a lot more within GRC. And COVID-19 has accelerated that. The more ops and IT infrastructures become the representation of the company, the more you need frontline involved in the process. You need people who both understand and have a stake in the business to be able to to be able to define what the controls are and what the compliance requirements are and how should you meet them. And I think that is the biggest shift that we are seeing in the last 6-7 months, moving away from immediate reactive model. Okay, we recognize all these links and we recognize the way the IT brings everything together, but now starting to really think about it and see what can be done about it.
Thank you, Sid. And it's very interesting that you picked up on the idea, and even Michael alluded to it, that a lot of organizations are looking at frontline engagement or enabling the frontline. How do you see, actually, I wanted to understand a little more on that. How do you see the organizations engaging with the frontline and to enable more like a risk-aware decisions and create a culture of compliance? With, of course, frontline is not new to the risk and compliance on a regular basis. So there will be a lot of challenges. So what challenges do they face and how do they overcome it?
Well, historically, the challenges have been, fairly fundamental issues. Frontline has P&L goals. You don't want them distracted from that. You want them to focus on that. There are no simple ways to change their targets without impacting performance. It's not been easy. I mean, it's a lot of hard work. Uh, and uh, and I think and what we are seeing is that over time, people have realized that there have been many attempts to solve this problem. Have business aligned risk groups and so on and so forth. But over time, we think that one of the central areas, and this is particularly something we're seeing in finance, also some of the other areas in energy and related areas, we're seeing a lot more focus on changing the organization in the sense that having a highly instead of having a front office aligned risk unit, having a risk aligned front office unit. So you have some people in front office whose responsibility is to work with risk and compliance. One way it can manifest itself is which is often through in many banks, it has manifested itself through something called chief control officer. So it's a frontline person who's engaged in defining, organizing, and executing controls. So the in many ways, we've seen many different modes work or not work in the past, but we think the current model is to try and ensure the frontline has a unit that is aligned to risk and compliance. That a special group or a subgroup whose job is to think about it, act on it, and stay aligned with it. And we think that is the single biggest shift. It's been ongoing for some time, but we think the last 6 months to a year has just accelerated it in terms of increasing the importance of that group or increasing the focus in that group.
That's very interesting. And Michael, I know you've also been a huge proponent of the frontline engagement, and you've continuously communicated to organizations that policy is the center of everything. So it'll be great to get your perspective on how organizations look at frontline, what challenges are they facing, and how can they overcome it.
Well, right now there's a lot of restructuring of GRC programs at the moment to be able to engage the first line of defense, or what we just call the first line now. I'd like to just call the front office, whether it's the teller at the bank, the insurance agent out there in the field, the coal miner in the coal mine. They're making risk and compliance decisions day in and day out. Risk is actually owned by the business, not by the second line or the third line. And so what we're seeing is a restructuring to be able to engage the front office of the organization, from operational management down to frontline employees, that take and own risk day in and day out. And so that, in fact, one financial services organization in London that I've been interacting with, they're not happy with their current GRC platform that's used globally, and they're specifically looking for, how do we have a solution that can equip and enable the second and third line with the analytics and modeling, but be an intuitive, engaging interface for the front office of the organization that needs to interact on risk every day. In that context, I'm seeing a lot of initiatives around policy management. I mean, there's, I think, about 31, if I remember, large global financial services firms I've talked to about policy management and reg change this last year. A lot of RFPs that have been won this past year in policy management as well. And one of the key things there is that singular portal for employees to be able to access policies in the midst of a crisis like what we're facing right now. There's been a lot of focus on that. We moved to the work from home environment. We have less people working. People are wearing multiple hats or roles, responsibilities, which means that they need to be aware of policies that they weren't aware of before because they have more responsibilities. In text, there's changing policies to support the IT security in the work from home environment, the home office expense policies. And the policies are changing as regulations changing to adapt to the current environment. And there's increased risk exposure of bribery and corruption, fraud, harassment, discrimination. This means that we have to remove policies, but we need to remind people of certain policies in their new context of where they're working environment. And so I see a lot of organizations trying to implement this singular policy portal. One insurance company that I talked to went into COVID-19 and found out they had 20 different policy portals in the on different technologies, and policies look different on each of the portals. And they were in different templates and writing styles. And they said, this is a mess. We need one singular portal into all the policies of the organization. And so I'm seeing a lot of traction, particularly on policy management, to be able to engage the front office of the organization.
That's extremely interesting, Michael, and the fact that you've highlighted with people working from home and businesses are obviously re-examining all of their programs. So, and Sid, you've mentioned that it's not the first time that the business are trying to engage with the front line. How is it going to be different this time, and what should the companies do to make it at least successful this time?
Well, I think first of all, I think one big difference, hopefully, is the order of engagement. So, one big element is that it is the front line that is aligning to risk and compliance rather than the other way around, and we think that's the right way to do the alignment rather than have risk and compliance aligned to front line. That is a useful thing, but that the other alignment is probably the stronger solution. But besides that, to ensure that risk and compliance teams are properly focused, we think that we need more interconnectedness, both technologically and just individually as people, in the sense, in terms of, and that interconnectedness needs to also look at a more analytical posture, in the sense that even simple things like, what is your risk posture, what is your risk tolerance, we think that there is a much higher degree of we need a lot of this stuff needs to be much more analytically expressed, because the data is increasingly available. We are in a much more digital world. You can literally monitor everything. So we think that it's much easier to now have an analytical posture, and having an analytical posture ensures much higher degree of much easier communication between all the different business lines and so on. And we think that is, and then finally, leveraging available technology. We think the ability to provide controls in a real time, in automated ways, is increasingly possible. That's what digitalization helps you to do. And we think that the risk and compliance teams need to exploit the fact that today it's possible to control a document, control a spreadsheet in automatic real terms. I mean, you can prevent a document being released in real time with the current technological tools. So there is a lot more that technology can be leveraged for control perspectives. And we think that this time, hopefully around, with proper interface of frontline and risk and compliance, the right controls can be designed for that to happen.
Thank you, Sid. So basically, businesses use technology, use data, use analytics, and use that intelligence to improve their engagement and collaboration with frontline, and frontline collaborates with risk, more than pushing the other way around. I wanted to bring in another, a dimension to this, is that, one of the biggest aspect of this is, of course, regulators. Now, how are regulators responding to this particular situation, Sid? And what are their expectations, and how should organizations prepare themselves for, the future?
I mean, some of this, you can see the tea leaves in the past. The senior management regime and many others like that have been essentially trying to move the responsibility to specific identified individuals, rather than the idea that it's the entire organization that's sort of generically at risk, if you will. So some of that has already happened. But in the recent past, you can see during the COVID crisis, the regulators have been incredibly pragmatic and flexible. They have focused on the operational aspects. They're focused on the aspects that financial institutions can control, rather than things that the financial institutions cannot control. So, and we have seen the whole cycle move over time, where initially they were focused on, okay, is your operations running properly? Do you have the right architecture for it, and so on? And now they're steadily increasing the pressure on why aren't the reports on time and so on. But if I were to summarize regulatory response, it would be there is a much higher focus on operational aspects, operational resilience, and there is an ongoing increased requirement. The regulators have been nudging the front line to take more responsibility. Some of the nudging is explicit, like senior management regime, and so on. And some of the nudging is less explicit. It is more we want to see that the front line understands the risk. We want to see frontline understands the operational challenges. We want to see that the frontline understands what the cloud is, how the cloud is impacting the regulatory reporting process, and so on. So some of it, and we would argue that in many ways the BOE is the advanced end of that curve, with its focus on data and operations, where it has been asking banks to report back on how their data and operations actually works. How is it controlled? Who has control over their processes, and so forth. I think we will see the regulators increasingly taking a much more operational view and a direct operational engagement, rather than just write down, here's a bunch of things you need to respond to. I think we're going to see a model where they're going to really ask, let me understand your operations, let me understand your vulnerabilities, and you explain to me what your vulnerabilities are. So I think it's a much more interactive process we're seeing from the regulators.
That's very interesting. So which means a little more detailed scrutiny, and then probably getting down to the next level of details from the regulator side. So Michael, I know you've been tracking this space, for a couple of years, and you've been a huge proponent of SMCR as well. It'll be great to get your perspective on how regulators are responding to this, and how do you see the regulatory landscape changing?
A lot happening right now. As Sid already mentioned, I mean, the accountability regulations are increasingly focused, putting management accountability at high levels in the organization, personal accountability, whether it's the UK SMCR, Australia's BEAR regulation, Ireland's SEER regulation, Hong Kong's managers in charge regulation, and now Singapore's new accountability regulation. We're seeing a global focus on a greater accountability. And as Sid mentioned, also operational resiliency with the FCA, Bank of England, PRA requirements to operational resiliency, but now most recent few weeks, the OCC guidance here in the United States, releasing some guidance on operational resiliency as well. So we're seeing a lot of focus there. And in this context, we're seeing a lot of regulatory change. I mean, in some areas, COVID-19 has slowed regulatory change down. I mean, back in 2019, global financial services firms are dealing with over 200 regulatory change events every business day, coming from 1,000 roughly regulators around the world. COVID-19 has slowed some of that in some areas, as well as picked it up in other areas. But one of the things I think we're really going to see coming to this is a demand for greater agility, which means that I think we're going to see a greater focus on being able to manage regulatory change, and this is going to come from the regulator side, and providing more standard interfaces into regulations and regulatory change. I mean, the FCA in the UK is leading the world in the digitization of their rule book, and I think we're going to see a lot of that from other regulators to assist in regulatory change. We're also seeing a lot of adoption and type technologies to be able to help manage and monitor regulatory change, so you don't necessarily need an army of lawyers to be able to do this. So one firm, this one in the life sciences industry in the United Kingdom, told me when I was in London last December that they find that artificial intelligence, natural language processing, to read regulations and interpret them and apply them to the organization is about 30, it's a gazillion times faster than how humans can read, but it's also 30% more accurate, because humans, when they're reading thousands of pages of text, I mean, our minds get distracted in things, machines don't. And so they find that artificial intelligence is faster, but it's also more accurate as well.
It's very interesting. And in fact, there was one of the panel, discussions, somebody mentioned that there is a directive from EU as well on digital operational resilience, focusing on the cyber risk and the third-party risk. So I believe the operational resilience is the theme for this year and probably into the coming future as well.
Yeah, and we're also seeing a lot of focus, and we're talking about Europe, like in Germany, I'm getting a lot of interactions on the IDW 340 audit standard, which is requiring risk aggregation normalization reporting at a very senior function level.
Exactly. So I think I wanted to touch upon the aspect of cybersecurity risk. I know with more people working from home and remote work, I'm sure the whole cybersecurity risk has increased drastically, including for the third-party risk as well. And both Michael, you and Sid has spoken about the cybersecurity risk and the third-party risk in the previous summit. How do you see, the organizations changing their, approach towards cybersecurity risk and third-party risk? Sid, if you could actually start on that, yeah.
Sure. So very quickly, I think there's a whole range of reactions, if you will. It ranges from really substantial shifts and best practice type focus to perfunctory, shifts, if you will. But if I were to sort of look at really the big shifts that have happened, is cybersecurity is now an intrinsic part of third party analysis, is an intrinsic part of looking at your vendors, looking at your supply chain. That has become an absolute integral part of that process. That's probably the most sort of robust application of quantification and analysis. But we are seeing quantification efforts everywhere. So it's still not standardized yet, but we're seeing a lot of quantification efforts where the insurance guys are trying to quantify what the risk is with a financial institution's infrastructure. But we are also seeing a much more analytically oriented. So there are three aspects of cyber risk quantification. One is to try and come up with a quantitative number as to what the total risk is. But there are many other sub elements that you need to look at. And the sub elements could involve looking at a more quantitative view of what your risk exposure is. Are you, is your formal risk exposure aligned with your actual one? Just looking at the networks, looking at the systems, you can come up with a quantitative perspective of what your effective risk exposure is. And you have a risk exposure which is your formal one that you have put in your documents. So there are many other ways of, just besides the pure risk number, there are many other ways of being analytical. And we are seeing some of those secondary ways of being analytical those have grown more dramatically. So quantifying risk posture, taking a more analytical view of your risk assets, taking a view of which parts of your organization are exposed to risk. We are seeing a much more analytical perspective there. That has become definitely much more analytical. But obviously, the third-party risk area is the area which has been most heavily impacted in terms of sort of a quantitative posture, if you will. Because standard cyber scores are now a part and parcel of third-party risk analysis, and we think it's going to get deeper very rapidly.
You said, and Michael, your view on the quantification and as well as third-party risks.
I mean, certainly, we need to put more effort into quantification, and there's a lot of risk management technologies and approaches out there which they try to mask more of a qualitative approach into quantification, and it's not true quantification. We need good, strong quantitative risk analysis with Monte Carlo analysis and distribution, and being able to see risk, because risk isn't just one point like on a heat map. I mean, risk itself is a distribution, like a bell curve of potential exposures, and we need to be able to see that and analyze that appropriately. Now, you mentioned the IT risk or information risk or cyber risk has so many different synonyms. I mean, that's another area, as I was mentioning earlier, you can't manage in its own little stovepipe in its little department, because it's pervasive throughout the organization with the Internet of Things. I mean, even in my home office around me here, I mean, I've got TVs connected and walls connected. My blender down in my kitchen is connected to the internet. I mean, everything's connected. And that's the way it is in business now too. We have the Internet of Things and everything's connected. Information's pervasive, technology's pervasive, and we have to manage cyber risk context of business operations and strategy and enterprise and other operational risks. And part of that gets into that other part of the question, the third party risk. Organizations are not defined by brick and mortar walls and traditional employees. Half the organization is the extended enterprise. I was talking to a global automobile manufacturer, and they're restructuring their enterprise risk program, particularly because of third-party risks. Because half of this global automobile manufacturer are not traditional employees. They're the outsourcers and service providers and vendors and suppliers and contractors, consultants and temporary workers. And what used to be an insider risk with the traditional employees now extends across an array of third-party relationships. And our enterprise risk management programs needs to address that. I've been talking to one European bank in which they're looking at having everybody in their data centers. And if you look at their data centers, most of the people in their data centers are not employees, they are third parties. The outsourcers, service providers, and contractors, consultants, every individual has to go through the same policies, particularly on GDPR, that their employees do. We have to address third-party risk in today's world.
Absolutely. And we're almost on the top of the hour. I just want one last question, to both of you. What are Michael, you said that there is a lot of change happening in the GRC functions itself. And what are the top concerns that you hear from the GRC functions, and how are they adapting to the changing environment? And how do you see this GRC function evolving in a post-COVID scenario?
Well, it's going to have to be able to make connectedness of risk. It was a year ago, 13 months ago, I published a paper in Enterprise Magazine by the Institute of Risk Management in London called Navigating Chaos. And I used the quote from Fritjof Capra, the physicist there, that the major problems of our times can be studied in isolation. They're interconnected and interdependent. So GRC programs are really restructuring to be able to collaborate better on risk and see the interconnections of risk I talked about earlier in this panel. In that context, we're seeing a lot of focus not just on the back office risk functions, but how do we communicate and engage the front office, as we talked about. That's becoming critical. And as part of that, how do we leverage technology that is intuitive and flexible and agile for the organization, the needs of the back office, but also deliver the engagement needed in the front office of the organization. We're seeing that too.
Thank you so much, Michael. And just 30 seconds, Sid, if you could give your insights on that.
Sure. I think the central aspect of this is better connections and networks. So the idea is that the GRC, both physically and professionally, so the GRC team needs to be more connected with the business groups, both from physical systems, but also individuals and so on. I think for the GRC guys, it's figuratively and technologically be networked or die. So yeah, that's the central issue, if you will.
Thank you so much, Sid, and thank you so much, Michael, for your time. I hope all of you have enjoyed this particular session, and please feel free to get in touch with us in case if you have any questions. We'll be happy to facilitate that and provide any responses that is required. Thank you so much, and have a nice summit.